Hi, I'm Chris Rakedal, State Superintendent of Public Schools for the state of Washington. Thanks for joining our annual update. By way of reminder, we host these during the day, and I know that can be a little frustrating for folks because they're working, and I deeply appreciate that, especially our educators. But this is an availability for the media. We've got some folks in person here, lots of folks online. It's a chance we get once a year to kind of go beyond any specific topic and open it up to questions at the end here to kind of get a snapshot of where we are. Yes, we're leading into the legislative session, and there's some content I want to share about that, but mostly it's a chance for the media to kind of curate stories as they go into session on policy and where are we in public education. And so I appreciate them very much, and I just want to say thanks to all the media who do this each year. I think it's helpful for you. I hope it is, and we can sure change the format. It's very helpful for us because we have so much data at OSPI and so much content that sometimes we don't do the best job helping you understand where to focus at or where to get it. So that's what this is about today. Special shout out to TVW. TVW is an amazing nonprofit organization in our state that is kind of one of the last remnants of just showing you the public sector in action. So I thank them for recording this. It's available to everyone afterwards who can tap into that. There's no editorial, there's no spin to it. It's just them covering the public sector and your tax dollars, and I think that's fantastic. So a big shout out to TVW and to everybody. Figure out a way to support them because we need that to survive for a good long time. So let's get started here. I've got some content for folks, and then we'll definitely open it up to questions. And if I don't cover something in this that we've focused on, ask the question. We can go beyond that today because we definitely want folks to get things answered for themselves. I'm going to start with some data we haven't yet presented. Every year during the year we present data. We've already presented assessment data. If you followed that, you know that most of our key metrics this year in assessment by grade level, we had improvement. 12 or 13 of our 14 metrics improved, which is great, mostly incrementally, but definitely still seeing gains out of the pandemic. And we've already presented that. It's on our website. But here's some stuff that we do annually at this time as well. Kindergarten readiness, we assess students who come into our school with 6 domains, and you can think of those all the way from like, do they understand numbers, all the way to behavior, basic reading and literacy skills. We saw a really high number for us on that, 55.3%. That's a huge kudos to our early learning providers in the public sector and the private sector, our legislature who's invested in early learning. We're seeing good results there. It does mean that nearly half of our kids, though, come to kindergarten not yet ready. So a big shout out to our educators in our K-12 system who then move them through that system successfully. And I think it's a great thing that we have this baseline in kindergarten. So congrats to everybody there. Regular attendance, it's gotten a lot of attention since the pandemic. The entire country struggles with that. On one hand, students are staying home when they're sick, which is adding to their lost attendance. On the other hand, students figured out how to focus on outcomes and not necessarily the day-to-day. I still want to say to all of our students, if you ever tune into this, we want you in school every day. The real world demands your attention on work or family or faith or whatever it is on a regular basis, and coming in and coming out is detrimental to learning. So stay in school, stay focused on that, attend every day. Our measure is a high standard in the state of Washington. We count all absences, excused and unexcused, for this measure, and a student who misses more than 18 days in a school year is considered chronically absent. Right now, that means we have 73% of our students who are missing fewer than 18 days in an entire school year, excused and unexcused. So congrats to students. Attendance continues to get better, still not at pre-pandemic levels. 72% of our 9th graders have passed all their classes in this last year. That's a very important measure for us. The research is clear. If you pass all your classes in 9th grade, you don't fall behind right away in credits, and that's one of the bigger hurdles. In a state like ours that requires 24 high school credits to graduate, there's very little room for error for students. So we've got great nonprofit partners who work with us on this. Appreciate the legislature focusing on this in the past, and it is one of those budget items that's a high priority for us as well, funding those strategies to keep 9th graders on track. Again, 72% this last year, it's a very good number for us. Dual credit, I always say, we don't actually have as big a problem getting kids into college. We have a problem with kids finishing college. And one of the ways we're not very good about telling the story is how many start transcripts and start getting college credit while they're in high school. In this state, 70% of our students leave high school with college credit of some kind. Now that number goes down when you just look at academic credit, sort of traditional liberal arts academic credit. It's higher because we have so many kids who participate in career and technical education programs. We have students starting the world of apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships, and they're starting the world of technical skills, and we don't recognize that as much. But when we combine all the academic and all the technical work, 70% of our students leave a Washington State high school as graduates with college credit already under their belt. Most of them have transcripted that credit. Lots of folks are working on strategies here. What does it mean to then get them to that next step where they finish and complete? It is a financial aid question for sure, but it's so much bigger than that. But for the measures that we look at OSPI, again, a big shout out to families who are tapping into Running Start and college in the high school and advanced placement and so many other great programs. It saves families money. We're a leader nationally in it, and I'm pleased to see that now over 70% of our students are in that. Graduation rates remain strong. We're just a tick below our all-time high graduation rates over 4 years, 82.6%. That number goes up as we have students who maybe need an extra term, maybe they need an extra year. Recent federal changes and state statute changes are now allowing our students with disabilities to get services through the end of age 22, and so some of those students need extra help. So we get this to 85, 86, 87%, but in that 4-year metric, we're nearly 83% graduation rate, again, with a pretty high bar for our graduation diploma. Again, don't want to overstate any of this relative to the pandemic. A lot of these measures have been improving for the last 5 years, which is great. Many of them are not pre-pandemic level, neither in the country nor here. So we're watching closely on how do we continue to make incremental progress. We can sure expedite that through some investments. And so I want to spend some time today with folks as well, talking about how we measure performance. It's understated. We just live in a time, particularly of social media, that dominates the ability for people to tap into sort of the natural human instinct to see the negative and to see the awful. And that's not new. It's just hyperscaled now because of our tools. It's harder to tell the story of hope and achievement and be honest about balancing those two things. And so we are going to lean into a dashboard here at OSPI that tries to grab the research-based elements that matter so much to student achievement. We've always had these in places, but we're focusing those more intently now. It's 12 measures. We're going to talk more about these in February. But we saw 10 of the 12 measures improve this last year. What you see here is really just a 3-year look. We have a baseline year, and then we have 2 consecutive years. Green is good, it's growing, and red means not so much. Most of the red that you see is very incremental changes. That one on the right, for example, is just 0.1% change in graduation rates. And so we're near our record high, but we're not quite there. But this is how we think about it here at OSPI. This hard work that's resulting now in us being very clear about what matters: kindergarten readiness, literacy skills by 4th grade, algebra skills by 8th grade, attendance along the way, access to dual language, access to college credits, graduation rates. These things make a ton of difference in kids' lives. Not a single measure will determine a student's success or failure, so we don't overemphasize anything, but it's a balanced approach to tell you what the research says matters a ton. It is test scores, but that's only a fraction, and it turns out that about 63% of student achievement is actually family and student-oriented measures, and so the school system's about a third. Most of that's in the classroom. Some of that is the principal who establishes the culture. I've said that before, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Personal responsibility is a big part of student achievement, and the school has a role to play. The public school system has a major role to play, but it's also a balance with families. So this, I hope, gives people a pretty clear sense of that. One last point on this, some of these variables we don't totally control. Kindergarten readiness is mostly a preschool development and a family development dynamic, but 40% or more of our ECAP slots, so our early childhood access slots, are provided by our public schools. 60% is either nonprofits or in-home care. So there's a role for our schools to play. Even if that role is just better coordination on the ground through a mixed delivery system, we want folks to know and have an expectation that your public school system does have a role to play in early learning. So I want to acknowledge that, because we have school officials that say, I don't control what happens between birth to 4. But the truth is, we can. We can be a better partner in that and engage in that. Couple of things now on, why are schools under financial distress? We get this question a lot. There's been a lot of folks who are writing about this, and we appreciate all the folks in media in all of its forms trying to kind of diagnose this question. Comparative data across the country, stuff around the world, here at home. I'll focus a lot around what's happening here at home. there are factors that make it very hard to lead schools today. So this is the moment where I shout out our school boards. They have really hard jobs, our superintendents, our building principals, and our school leaders. I've given analogies before on our human instinct to try to say, let's just get rid of all the other variables and focus on the one thing you're supposed to do, and if you're up, you're good, and if you're down, you're not doing a good job. But no industry works that way. No human being works that way. So some of these factors are out of school district control, and a lot of them, though, are in school district control. So let's just start right away with our enrollments. This is the myth-busting part and some embrace of some of the realities. Our enrollments during the pandemic came down a lot. You can see that here. There's no question. For nearly a year of remote learning, it impacted kids and families, and a lot of folks said, gosh, this isn't going to work for me, and so I'm going to try homeschool, or if I can afford the resource, private school or other options. We saw that initial decline, and then we've seen pretty steady increases since then. That steady increase is because, you'll see later in slides here, families don't stick with it all the time. It doesn't really work for them, or maybe they've brought their child to where they think they can support them, and then they want the expertise, the certification, the professionalism in math or science or some other subject in school. And so we see a return back to our schools, and I'll show you that. But over here to the right, you're seeing a decline this last year of nearly 10,000 enrollments. We're following this very closely because we've been saying for years, watch out for the demographic cliff that's coming. We have roughly 85,000 kids who are in their junior year and senior year. Each year, we have far fewer 5-year-olds coming into the system. So some of the narrative is families are bailing out of public school, and the truth is they're not. They certainly happened right after the pandemic, and since then it's just been very, very steady growth in homeschool and private school, which I'm going to show you. But we have a demographic challenge, and a reminder that when a student, when enrollments in a school go down within that school year, the legislature requires OSPI to pull money away from that school. That's not the case in a lot of other public sector or private sector businesses where your revenue stream stays relatively constant, and even though you've got sort of inputs coming and going, you're stable. Our districts lose money immediately, almost immediately, when enrollments go down. So this is going to be a challenge that persists. I want to show you, again, a little more of the why. This is birth rates in the state of Washington. It peaked in 2016 at over 90,000 births in our state. 2016, y'all, so those are 9 and 10-year-olds now. You're talking about 4th and 5th graders as the biggest group we're going to have. And again, 90% of them attend public school, and about 10% of them choose other options. But that means as you look to that line to the right, as it continues to decline, those students are coming into our school system, and they're going to age through the system in those low cohorts of 80,000 and 82,000 births, which means 72, 75,000 actual attendees. We're going to graduate kids at 80 or 85,000. And so you're going to see a steady decline for many, many years in the state of Washington in total attendance. This saves the legislature money because if there are fewer students, they pay for fewer enrollment slots, which is an understandable budget model. But the distress on school districts is enormous. I've given this analogy before, I'll say it again. If you have 25 kids in a 3rd grade classroom, and the next year you have 24 kids because of declining birth rate and the cohorts are smaller, you just lost 4% of your revenue in a school, but you didn't get a chance to do anything on the expenditure side. You still need a teacher for 24 kids versus 25. You still have to run the bus at higher fuel costs and higher inflation. You still have to heat the building and turn on energy and access basic needs of kids. Almost nothing changes in the cost model of school systems except they lose revenue. And that is becoming a bigger problem for our schools. Here's a really clear way to think about it. The top line are 11th graders. The bottom line are 1st graders. Changes over time. We now only have about 73,000, 74,000 1st graders in each cohort. We have about 87,000 juniors for another year or two. As they graduate, go to their senior year and graduate, we're going to have this big, big shift at overall numbers each year. Big graduating classes, small cohorts coming in, and that isn't going to change necessarily anytime soon. By the way, we look at 1st grade because a lot of families delay their kids' start till they're 6, and so kindergarten numbers are a little fudgy. Some folks homeschool early and within a year come back. We don't look at the senior year as much either because we have so many kids who stay for a 5th year or a 6th year or beyond. So the 11th grade and the 1st grade years are really solid from a data standpoint on what's happening, and that's what you see here. I love color. I love display. My team will tell you that if you can do it in a picture instead of 1,000 words, please do so. 2 things here. This is every single enrollment number through time for each grade on the far right. So over here in 2025, this is what we saw in this last year. 69,000 students in kindergarten, 87,000 juniors. So kind of mirroring what I just showed you there. So for any given year, you can see this gap is big. We're graduating big classes and bringing in fewer. But the other thing that we do when we look at this is we look at the diagonal lines. And if I just had you focus right now, for example, on 2020, pandemic year, very small numbers of kindergarten starts because so many families said, I'm going to delay my kid a year, or I'm going to try a homeschool model. When those kids in the next year, 21, became 1st graders, 4,000 of them came back to public school. The next year as 2nd graders, almost 2,000 more kids came back, and another 2,000 the next year. And so by the time we get down here to last school year, we have 82,000 kids in the 7th grade, but they only started as a cohort of 70,000. Families came back to public school after the pandemic when things shook out. Not totally, but for the most part. So one of the things I challenge everyone to do is understand the demographic impacts, but also understand the rhetoric of everyone's leaving public school is really harmful. It's not accurate, and I'll show you some more detail there, but it has the effect of sensational when in fact a lot of families are vulnerable. They don't have resources for private school. They don't have time. 2-income household having to work, or maybe a single parent having to work. They want to know that their public school is high quality, which it is, and they want to know that it's a safe place, which it is. And so sometimes adults try to score political points for different reasons, but the impacts really ripple into families, and I would caution us all to be careful about that. Here's the homeschool numbers. It spiked during the pandemic, as you see. About half of those within 2 years said, no, this doesn't work for me, and they came back to public school. And then we've just seen this slow, steady growth since then, and I don't think that will change. There's a national movement here. We've done a better job partnering with the homeschool community to make sure they get access to high-quality materials. We try to include lots of homeschool community networks into professional development. This is a really important choice that families make, and I support that choice. I just want to make sure that folks understand we want to be good partners in helping them with content. This system is available to them anytime. We have more and more families who say, I'm going to go kind of half-time these subjects I'm going to focus on at home, but I want access to a cooperative of the region or the public school because I want my kid to get access to things. Our schools are here for that. They're here to work with families either way, full-time with us or part-time with us. But the steady growth of homeschool it's a national trend, and it's okay. It isn't an exodus. It's about 1,000 students a year growth out of 1 million students in the state of Washington. Here's your private school numbers. A little bit tough to see. This is every single grade from kindergarten to 12th grade stacked up in the private school system. They lost enrollment like the public schools did right during the pandemic. They bounced back within a year or two. And then there's just been this slow, steady growth of 1,000 or 1,500 students a year, again, out of 1 million kids in the state of Washington. So not big growth in the private school or the homeschool networks. But important choices that families make. Again, my point here is stick to the facts and the data, respect families' choices, don't overstate it in order to try to do harm to the public school system. All right, I said there are 3 big things happening to schools. One is loss of enrollment, about 70% of which is due to demographics, about 30% is homeschool private school impacts. The second thing is the underfunding, and there's such an amazing debate amongst adults around whether we have enough money in schools or not. So I want to spend some time being as candid as I can about this. Yes, public school investments have grown. Not at the pace of the rest of state government over the last decade, but certainly have grown. That growth came exclusively as a result of the state Supreme Court telling our legislature they weren't amply funding our schools. That's the McCleary case you heard about. The legislature had funding formulas. They weren't funding their own formulas. They eventually got compliant with the law for the most part. They added a lot of money 7 years ago. That was a spike in funding. Since then, adjusted for inflation, we now have less money per student than we did then. So that already accounts for enrollment decline. That accounts for money that's been added due to healthcare cost inflation and salary inflation. The legislature's added money to feed more kids and to add more counselors and nurses and school psychs and mental health supports and so many good things. When we add all that up, though, and divide by our students, we have less money today adjusted for inflation than we did 7 years ago. There's a national metric that comes out of a law center at Rutgers University that looks at regionally adjusted funding per student. So this is where the rubber really meets the road here, and Washington State's pretty average. We have a high cost of living in the Puget Sound. That's reflected in the way we fund schools there. But other states have really high cost of living, and they spend even more money per student. There are states that have very low cost of living, and so they get less money per kid. Because at the end of the day, you're investing in a system of adults that support students, from teachers to principals to bus drivers to nurses and aides. So when you regionally adjust for cost of living, Washington State's pretty average. We're not high, we're not low, so this policy choice keeps coming to us. Do we want to be a high invested state? And obviously the way we fund schools today isn't getting it done. Lots of evidence to that. The same law center gives Washington State an F grade, a failing grade. We're 40th in the nation in how much of our economy we put back into our schools. It's a pretty good measure because it says every state's different. States like ours have a heavy state investment. States all over the South invest a lot from their local community through property taxes. So whether you're a locally funded, state-funded system, they merge all of those resources together, and then they look at how much you are investing as a share of your economy. Washington State is a booming economy. We have innovative partners here. We have some of the most successful corporations in the world. We have some of the highest wealth in the world. It has spun out industries around the world, right here out of the Puget Sound and in parts across the state. You cannot deny that we are one of the wealthiest states in the nation. Per capita income in this state is something like 3rd or 4th in the nation. We have a lot of resource here. We don't choose to put the same percentage into our schools that other states do. The national average is 3.1% of the private economy, the total economy, goes back into public schools. In our state, it's 2.58%. That gap is $4 billion a year. $4 billion a year. We've never been at the national average, but right after that court case, if you look at this time period right here, we got real close to closing that gap with the rest of the country, and now it's slipped back again. A couple things to note from this: the national average is up there in the black line. It's gone down across the country on average. Washington State made gains for a while. After the McCleary case, it's now down again. So the whole country has taken general prosperity over the last 6 or 7 years and diverted those investments either back into the private sector or into human services when it comes to government. It has not gone to K-12. It has not gone to higher education. And so we're doing a short-term damage that's going to result in very long-term impacts if we don't change that dynamic. Again, we're 40th in the nation in the way we reinvest. It's an F grade. We all own this collectively, but I'm growing more concerned that we talk about it the wrong way, and so I'm going to spend a little time here with you all, maybe rephrasing some of the way it's discussed. One of the ways people talk about is, well, what is the share of K-12's budget in Washington State as a share of the total budget? It was at 45, 46% when folks came to the courts and said it's not enough, and the court said we agree, and they told the legislature to invest, and the legislature did, and they got that number over 50%. Now, that's not in the Constitution. That percentage isn't mandated, but it's an indication of the relative value of folks making decisions around public school investments, and in this case, K-12 only, not early learning, not higher ed. Ever since the court relinquished jurisdiction in that case and said, we're done, back to you, legislature, keep funding, K-12 has been shrinking. We're now down to 43%. The budget that the governor just presented is about the same, so it didn't go up, didn't go down. But now we're below where we were pre-McCleary as a share of the state budget. Again, some people don't like that metric. They say, hey, if the economy's booming, it doesn't automatically mean we should invest in schools. Except I just showed you we're a low invested state. We have capacity to do that without impacting the economy the way other states have been able to invest. So I challenge everybody to think about that. I challenge you to think about the fact that we have less money per kid adjusted for inflation. I challenge you, and that's this line right here, by the way, where again we grew our funding per student. We adjusted for real impacts of inflation. We're now below that. There's been some steady climb in the last couple of years, which is great, but we're not there. But we have to think differently. So here's the other way I'm going to challenge it. Recent tax increases have people believing that Washington's fallen off the cliff in terms of taxing its citizens. Again, aggregate data, so we're looking at everybody. We're looking at averages here. When you look at all the taxes we pay in the state, we're ranked about 28th. So we're not even at the midpoint in tax burden. Now, everyone says, hey, this is 2023 data. The legislature just passed taxes. Couple myths I want to bust about that. God, I love my legislators, both sides of the aisle, but they don't talk about this stuff very clearly, so I'm going to try. When they raised, say, $12 billion, that was over 4 years. That's $3 or $4 billion a year over 4 years on a $70 billion budget. It barely was a dot on the map when it came to the share of our economy. It kept services, vital services, flowing to folks who needed it. It kept schools from being cut even more. They did raise revenue, but people should stop talking about $12 billion tax increases when it was $3 or $4 billion a year. Like, talk the way normal people talk. If I said what your salary is to every person in this room or online, you wouldn't multiply it by 4 and tell me your salary is $1 million or $250,000 or $500,000. You'd tell me an annual salary. And we should be more honest about that. So the tax increases that the legislature added in the last year or so might move us to average, might move us to 25th in burden. It's certainly going to increase us because we raised them faster than the national average. This data delays a little bit. We'll keep looking at it year in and year out, but all of the changes we've seen in Washington State have never moved that needle to make our tax burden get to the halfway point. Here's the problem, and this is where I'll spend some impassioned time with you all. It masks the reality of living in Washington State to say our average tax burden is below the national average. It's not fair because we don't tax everybody the same. Our wealthiest Washingtonians, 1%, of the wealthiest folks, pay 4.1% of their incomes in state taxes. You know why. Just because you make 10 times as much money as your neighbor doesn't mean you need to buy 10 times as many cars, which are taxable, or 10 times as much toiletries, or 10 times as many anythings. So when you think about what's taxable in the state, it's heavy on goods. We have much lower tax rates on services, but the economy's been booming in services. So over time, our state just generates less revenue as the economy grows. We just don't keep up. And we've been shifting that tax burden with all the new increases to things like sales taxes at the local level and things like property taxes at the state level and B&O taxes which get passed on. And so families are hurting. And I think it's time for both sides of the aisle to drop the rhetoric and to be honest that one of the biggest challenges in our state is property taxes. If you ask people what they're supposed to do to live the American dream, they would say, focus on school, get a good education, get a good job, maybe move jobs, but certainly build a career, and invest in something that's an appreciable asset. And we've told them for 50 or 60 years, buy a home. In this state and states around the country, when you buy that home, you don't get to cash in on it. It's not a source of income, but it's an increasing source of your tax burden. And people are frustrated across the state as I talk to them. From 70-year-olds who are retired on fixed incomes to 35-year-olds buying their first home, it's unaffordable. Part of that, not all of it, not even the majority of it, but part of it is the tax responsibility. Families now paying twice as much property tax as they did 10 years ago. People should keep believing in the idea that they can take their hard work and turn it into an appreciable asset. But taxing that appreciable asset as if it's a cash generator for families is not real. It costs them more to have something they hope is worth a lot later. You double that down with the fact that a ton of our families, more than half of them, will never qualify for financial aid, for example, in higher ed, despite a great financial aid system for low-income families in the state. And more families tap into their homes' equity in order to pay for their child's education. But unlike an investment where you can just sell the equity and get the cash, you have to take a loan. Something you own that you put dollars into, you have to take a loan in order to get your kids through college or an apprenticeship program or training program. It's broken. And it's time for Democrats to admit that. It's time for Republicans to drop the rhetoric and say all taxes are bad. We have vital services in the state that have to be paid for. The economy will continue to grow for the next 100 years, but the share of it going to public services will shrink if we do nothing. And the frustration of putting that tax burden increasingly on middle-class families has got to change. So I'll say a lot more about this in January and February, but the legislature has tasked me last year, my organization here at OSPI and a lot of partners, into coming up with a better way to fund schools. We will deliver that report a year early, so instead of 2 years from now, it'll be next year at this time, if not sooner. It will describe how we can invest in our schools more equitably so that high poverty communities get more resources, and it will have a revenue component to it. It will challenge everyone to think differently around how we tax, because as the school superintendent, I have to tell you that not all taxes are the same. And while everyone wants to reduce the burden on the very lowest income that you can see here are paying nearly 14% of their disposable income on state taxes, that is a good thing in the short term to help people get relief. It's not going to increase home ownership. Property tax reduction will do that. So I'll talk about this more in the next couple months during this session, but let's be honest, the legislature has a lot on their plate. This isn't the year or in 60 days where you can do a massive overhaul of the tax code, but they better make progress on setting up the opportunity to do that. And so what I bring to the conversation unique is in some ways consistent. We need tax reform. The wealthiest don't pay an equitable share. Our middle-class families pay too much in particular. And I'll bring the idea that we also have to think about where affordability matters most. And for families raising kids, which now takes over $400,000 to raise a child through the age of 22 years old, between early learning and child care cost and the cost of an extra loved one and then putting them through higher ed, there is a massive burden on middle-class families in the state of Washington, and we can do better. And I think the thing that we can inject in the conversation is, where do we shift that revenue responsibility, that fairness responsibility to the wealthy, and legitimately lower taxes for folks who are in the middle class who are struggling? It's delaying home ownership. It's delaying families who think they can put their kids through college because they know for half of them they're going to have to tap into savings, which they don't have, or their home equity, which is taxed at higher rates. So I challenge all of the folks in the state of Washington to think about this question not from a place of rage, but a place of solution-based. Our kids need help, higher ed needs investments, families need tax relief. And we have to stimulate a demand in housing and a housing affordability. So I'll be kind of a pit bull on this question of property taxes. The other angle I bring to this, of course, is now I have communities who have long supported their school district's levies, and now they're questioning that. And they're not questioning their local schools. They like their local schools, but they're hearing all this national rhetoric that is mostly untrue around education, but then they pair that with their tax bill, which jumped mightily after the McCleary decision because the state used the state property tax gain. And now they say, gosh, this is getting to the point where I'm really struggling to pay my bills. Is the school support where I pull back? And that's untenable. Our legislature did a great job pulling school levies down from 30% of our budgets or so down to about 17%. They did a great job, but they replaced that with a state property tax at a very high rate, nearly maxed it out at the state level. So that's a lot there. I know it can be frustrating for folks to hear tax conversations and say, but where's the plan? That's going to get, I think, talked about a lot. The governor's certainly weighed in, and I'm grateful for the governor. It's not easy for first-term governors to take political risk on taxes, but he's out there saying a millionaire tax, and I think it's one idea. There are taxes on payroll that are an option. There are folks who want wealth taxes and higher capital gains. Those are all good conversations, but they're all one-sided about just more taxes. What I think we should be talking about is, where would we get the most impact of raising those and using some of those proceeds to help middle-class families trying to raise families, and that's in property, specifically the state property tax. So I appreciate everyone being here today. The responsibility of our public education system is enormous. It's never been more challenging. The rhetoric's never been higher. The lack of integrity around the real research, how much families matter in this versus just saying, if a kid isn't reading to standard in 4th grade, it must be a whole system that failed the kid. Everyone has a shared responsibility here, but I do think there's a more humane reaction to this that's going to keep encouraging people to want to be teachers and principals. But right now, that's pretty out of balance. So again, I thank the media for being here, because you take the time to come here and curate stories for the year. And I guess I would challenge you on the editorial side as well as the news side to think about balance and to spend more time in classrooms listening to kids and their laughter and their fun. And we've got 1 million kids in school today. And they're glad the sun's out, and they just got off break, and they're learning math and science, and they're just excited. That's the reality for most people. It's not what we read in editorial pages and Facebook posts and national party rage. Last thing for me is I also think the school system has to step up its accountability systems, and that word gets overused, but if you think about it as responsibility of taxpayer money. So this year we're telling folks pretty candidly that we're launching legislation. Don't know if it'll pass. We need the House and Senate and the governor to agree to this, but we think school districts need to focus a lot on policies that establish at least minimum fund balances. The reason we have school districts in financial distress, we've covered that. Their costs are going high due to inflation. They're losing enrollments due to demographics primarily. The state doesn't invest like it did even 7 years ago. The state as a whole doesn't invest as a share of the economy like other states. We're in a tough spot. But that also means we have to think about policies that put districts in position to be stable so they don't end up having to come to OSPI saying, I'm in binding conditions and I need some kind of intervention. And one of the ways you do that is you have a minimum fund balance. I know it surprises people, but our school districts aren't required to have a certain minimum fund balance. They do because they're responsible, but it's all over the place. So we think there are reasonable policies to have a minimum and a maximum. When voters support their school district's levies or they support revenue investments in the state, they also expect those dollars to be deployed to support students in our schools. And so sitting on 40 and 50% fund balances is no better than having almost no fund balance. So we're going to propose a framework there. It's unpopular with some folks, we get that, but we think it's the right thing to do. We also think it's time to have every school board member who's elected, all 1,477 of them, go through fiscal training. You are overseeing 43% of the state's budget that ultimately gets passed through to 295 school districts, half a dozen charter schools, or a dozen of them, and a half a dozen tribal compact schools. And every one of those folks needs to step into what it means to be fiduciaries, financial overseers of responsible taxpayer money. These are citizens who want to step up and help their communities and their schools, and they need to not have to pay out of pocket, nor should their school districts have to pay, to get them to a position of being good stewards of money. So we would propose the legislature step up and fund financial training for school board members. There are other things for sure. It's always a good time to examine our efficiencies and lack thereof at times. If we can deliver services with fewer administrators, we should. If we can do it with fewer governing bodies, we should. These are hard questions. It's emotional to communities. The commitment I keep making to folks is we can have fewer district level costs and not close schools. So giving folks access to their schools matters. We have 2,400 schools in the state, and there's no reason not to do that because they're geographically deployed and they're in communities and neighborhoods. But where can we share costs, which a lot of our districts do a great job sharing maintenance costs or business costs. We have 9 educational service districts, these regional leaders who in some cases are the HR departments and the IT departments and the business offices of some of our small schools. So they're finding efficiencies everywhere, but we have to double down on it within our system, and I think the legislature should take a greater role in initiating that, directing that, and expecting that. So hard conversations to come this session and beyond, but if we don't do it on the spending side and the progressive revenue side that also offers middle-class tax relief, I'll be back here in 2 years telling you we're in financial distress. And folks are getting a little tired of that because they don't understand how their taxes can go up and still be in distress. So there's solutions to this. Lastly, I just want to say, again, thanks to everyone for being here. We're going to open it up to questions. We're going to go in person first to a couple folks in the room, and then we'll go remote. All questions are okay. It doesn't have to be specific to the subjects I covered. Although if I don't have an answer, I always reserve the right to say we're going to get you data later because we have a lot of data, and I appreciate that. To everyone watching, thank you again to TVW. Thank you very much. This is the Q&A portion. I think it can be as informative as the rest, but this is a pretty clear break, and we'll just go to our first question. Katie, I think you're going to monitor that for us here.
Just because I've got my video going as well. Carlene Johnson, reporter with the Center Square. Good to see you, Chris. Thank you for all the information. There was a lot here. As you're well aware, a couple of significant cases before SCOTUS next week, not from Washington State, but certainly could have consequences for Washington State when it comes to the protection of girls in sports and couple of folks from here in Washington State intend to be there, and one of them being that Francis Stott from Tumwater. I'm sure you're aware of that case. What are your thoughts about that? And I know you've been resistant to some of the federal directive there, but this could have consequences for Washington. So what are your thoughts about those cases?
Yeah, for the better part of 20 years, Washington State's had a really good civil rights framework. Our legislature has added certain protected classes of students. So this is law in the state of Washington. My job's to uphold the law, and I'm going to do that relentlessly. If the law changes because our legislature changes it, we'll uphold the law. If the law changes because our state courts strike it down or change it, we're going to uphold the law. If a federal court does it and it goes through the process, we'll uphold the law. That said, I got to tell you, this is part of the rhetoric that I think harms the conversation. These are all sincerely held beliefs on both sides of this issue, whether it's transgender athletes or any of these things. These are sincerely held beliefs. So folks on both sides of this conversation, my message to them is, keep exercising your civic responsibility to speak out and share your beliefs. That's what it's about. The initiative process that's underway, that's about them trying to change the law. That's a legal process, and so I really respect that. What gets lost in this is we've had transgender athletes for decades and decades and decades, and our schools know how to protect their privacy and their interests and the privacy and interest of everyone else. We've been doing this a long time. It's acute now because somebody's determined that it's a really good wedge issue politically. It isn't that it's ramping up or that it's new. So we're going to keep following those court cases. We're going to follow the state laws. We're going to protect all students' privacy. Our laws actually focus on privacy. That's not really well known. It's not just transgender athletes who get to express their preference based on self-identity, but any student who doesn't feel comfortable in a locker room or what have you gets access to either a private space or a space where they feel safe. All students, not just transgender youth. So there's some myth busting that will go on here, but let's let the process play out, both our initiative process as well as our legal processes. And in the meantime, I just keep encouraging our school districts, follow the law. That's what your job is. Let the courts figure this out, and let policy changes potentially figure this out. But our transgender youth are vulnerable. We know about the higher suicide rates. We know that they need belonging like everybody else. I think our state does a good job in those protections. Some people disagree, and it's their right to pursue changes in that regard. But I hope, as I said earlier, we can still make this around kids and what's best for them. We're talking about young people trying to figure out who they are in the world, and they don't need to be dehumanized. I've been doing a lot of research and a lot of reading lately on the comparisons between the 1920s and the 2020s. Stock market booms and speculations and all that stuff, but also social culturally, and the attacks on gay and lesbian people in the 1920s, and this culture of it's all choice and it's all mental health disease. I hear that rhetoric today, and it's disgusting. These are folks living their authentic lives, and we need to respect that as they go through that process and protect everyone's privacy along the way. We can do that without dehumanizing people or the leaders who are trying to uphold the law as it exists today. So again, I would encourage everyone to tone down the rhetoric that does the harm. Do follow your civic opportunity here to make change. That's part of the process. But we can do right by all kids by being good role models of how to debate civilly and respectfully and respect the diversity of all of our families and communities. I think we need to up our game.
I may come back to the initiative questions, but I want to ask on your last section about your call for progressive revenue, tax reform, et cetera. What I didn't hear is how much of that money do you want locked in for education? Mm-hmm. Because if you do get new taxes on the wealthy, and you do promise tax relief for the middle class, do you make any gain in how much funding goes to school and address the underfunding?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. If you couldn't hear the question, it's really this tax concept, changing it to progressive taxation. It's got demands on the resources, and so what's my perspective on how much education gets of that? Well, we have an immediate crisis now against inflation. It's not being funded. We call it MSOC. It's a wonky term for maintenance and supplies and operating costs. Those kind of costs are acute. Transporting kids right now is underfunded. We need immediate relief for that, and none of this will happen real fast. We have still gaps in what it takes to accommodate students with disabilities versus what the state provides in direct formula. So there's a good $1 billion or more that we really could use right now. There isn't a magic answer on the exact amount because, as I said, If the goal of the state of Washington is to meet the national average, we need $4 billion more, and I can tell you how you spend that kind of money. You go into class size ratios and early grades and you actually expand those. We have 27,000 students needed in the state of Washington at the middle school level to generate in our funding formula one school psychologist in middle school. So you immediately change the ratios to reflect the world we live in today, not the world we lived in the 1920s. So part of our plan, as I said, the assignment we got is, what does an equitable funding model look like? And as part of that, I'll show how you can raise revenue. Lots of people have ideas on raising revenue amongst the wealthy, and even some wealthy folks have said, yeah, we need to do that. But I'll also show you, I think, how to reduce some important taxes that people feel every day, and it's building. And the difference, because it's not one-to-one, is investments in education, specifically the acute things, changing our funding formulas, driving more money to high poverty communities. And the last thing I'll say is, if not this session, certainly the next, I'll present a way to completely transform the way the middle class accesses higher education in the state of Washington. It's too costly. That is not a responsibility or burden of our institutions of higher ed. They absolutely need investment. But we bought into this idea during the housing crisis and thereafter that we could have high tuition costs and high financial aid and make up the difference. That is very true for low-income families. That is very true for families with a lot of resources on the right side of this graph. But for the vast bulk of Washington families, they will never access federal or state aid at the income levels they make, nor can they afford it. So they are tapping into everything they can. They're going into debt for their kids. I think the new public policy in Washington can be that if the economy demands a student to get some sort of post-secondary credential, something after high school, that starts to sound like the new basic ed. And about every 50 years, we add something. High school was added to basic ed. Kindergarten was added to basic ed. It's time for us to think about higher education as a universal access system for at least a couple years, and I'll provide a lot more detail down the road. But you asked how we do this. We net out more from that tax change, and then we invested in schools, and some of it's higher ed.
To follow up into the budget, I wanted to ask about the governor's budget, but a piece of what he's doing in the supplemental budget proposal takes almost $1 billion of tax money, new tax money from the workforce education, which is paid by large firms, and uses it to supplant existing dollars. So the idea of new taxes has been taken by the legislature, but they're just using it to replace other dollars. I presume you don't agree with that in the budget proposal, but so stepping back, what's your report card on the supplemental budget proposal from the governor on the K-12 system? Where do what is your grade for what's good? Where does it need improvement? Where is it bad?
It's good that it doesn't touch basic ed. So the governor cut some pretty important stuff in his proposal. And again, the governor's responsibility here was, I'm going to show you a balanced budget without significant revenue changes to show you where we are. And lots of governors in the past have done that, and his team worked hard on that. It's good that it didn't touch basic ed, so constitutionally protected classroom supports. But we have a growing transitional kindergarten program where 4-year-olds need extra help, and the current system doesn't provide it, and our schools do. And those were cut by like nearly 2,000 slots in the proposal. So not technically basic ed, but an enormous impact. We have kids accessing college credit, like I said here, and that was just increased recently to allow more kids to take more college credits while they're in high school to save families money. It's a great middle class support system, and that was cut in the budget. Not wholly, of course, but in part. So these things that are sort of on the edge, levy equalization. So we have property poor school districts that get additional money from the state to try to equal the fact that we have wealthy communities that can raise a lot of money locally with their levies. That was set to go up, so it wasn't cut from today's levels, but that increase was canceled out. So I'm complimentary of the fact that the direct classroom is mostly protected, but I'm never going to support a budget that cuts education when we've demonstrated year after year through both research and through the interest of the communities that they support their schools and they want these things funded. They're going to do them, so they're either going to pay out of pocket, which is the worst case scenario because wealthy families are going to be able to access college credits on their own and low income and middle class won't. Wealthy families are going to still buy high quality early learning slots. Middle class and low income families won't. So I respect that the governor had a tough job to do. He did it by trying his best not to impact direct classroom supports, but any cuts in education that build student success is a cut to education, and we can't afford that right now. We got to think differently about where we're going, or we're going to do the same things over and over again.
The chance to do one more question, and then I know there's folks online that want to get their questions in. I don't remember what the bill number was, Chris, last year, but I remember there were some, and maybe it passed or not, but there was discussion of sort of an exit survey, if you will, of families that had left public schools and why they did. There was resistance to that, and I think we settled on something. Jerry, you probably remember this better than I do. Settled on something that was, no, let's talk to families that decided to stay instead, like the good side of it. Have you given some consideration again to supporting potential legislation to do an exit survey? Because some of the families that have left have shared reasons why, some of it over the issues that we discussed in my last question. Isn't it important to find out why they've left?
And why they come back. So perhaps
Why they left too.
both, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Sure, but it's also money spent on surveying folks instead of direct classrooms. So yes, these are important things. I think districts have been doing this for a long time. Do we need a single statewide approach to that survey? Maybe. I'm open to it. I certainly would support it. In the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't cost that much, but I would support it if it's comprehensive, you know. So why is it that 3,000 families a year pull their kids out of homeschool and send them to public school? Is it the quality? Is it the access? Is it financial reasons? There's a two-way street to this conversation, and we keep framing it in the negative because that's what we do to sell things. But there really is a bigger conversation here, and it would be good to know. It's also been going on forever. People have moved in and out of the system forever, and between school districts, they make those choices as well. So it would be good information. We support that. Not sure a single statewide approach to every community is the right answer, but I'm open to it, especially if it informs. And I think we know a lot of the reasons already. They've been around for a long time. Some of those schools can address, and some of those are just personal choices by families. Yeah.
We're going to questions online now.
Great.
First one is Eric Rosane with Tri-City Herald.
Hi, Superintendent. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you, Eric. We're going to get rid of
Okay.
the echo here, but we got you.
Appreciate you taking questions, Superintendent. So I had a question just about federal immigration enforcement. About 2 months ago, some agents paid a visit to a kind of like ECAT building to question a staff member about individuals they were seeking information about. And the district followed OSPI's procedures that you guys put out at the start of the first Trump administration, or the start of this Trump administration. I'm curious if your office has heard of any other instances of agents who have paid visits to Washington schools or since the start of this new administration, and have districts been able, have they been utilizing those procedures, and are those procedures working?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So we put out guidance, and we put it out consistently before, but there is a process to this that all federal administrations have historically respected as well. If an ICE agent comes to a school and wants answers, they have to show identification, they have to show proof that they have a legal reason to be there. The school district can pause long enough to make sure that superintendent's there, principal, contact family, for example. We don't just let anyone into our schools for obvious safety and privacy reasons. And so it's a pretty high bar, and quite candidly, our observation is that mostly the federal administration of the state has respected that in our schools. There was tradition for a long time that hospitals, churches, and schools were safe places for families. Kids didn't choose these things. They're just trying to benefit from learning. And so mostly we've seen success there. We get sort of questions sometimes from people who say, I think this is happening here or there, and we track those down as fast as we can. And we've not seen evidence of any detentions or any contacts during school. Certainly properties around schools, I think, is happening. Just want to say also, we're trying to look at the data as consistently as we can to see if there are enrollment trends emerging either from the reality of detentions or deportations or the fear. I don't want to send my kid to school because I fear that something might happen. We definitely see changes in the state enrollment. We talked about that. It's harder for us to tell you that at this point there's a statistically significant reality in one community or another attributable to immigration enforcement and some of those actions. But we're trying to figure out if we can see in the data hotspots and then call districts and say, are your enrollments down because of this reason? And so far, that's been very, very limited in this state, but we're tracking it as closely as we can.
Our next question is from Charlotte Alden with Cascadia Daily News.
Hey, thanks for doing this. I had two questions related to school construction and bonds. The first one is where you would stand on a potential reduction to the bond passage rate from 60 to 55 or 50. And then I'm also curious if you could speak a little bit to the School Construction Assistant Program revision study, which I know came out a couple months ago. Just on what from that you think is sort of the most doable to support districts who struggle to rebuild facilities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate that. Let's start in reverse order here a little bit. Actually, we'll take them in order. I support a simple majority. I have for a long time. I think it's wrong to say you live in a democracy and then have super majorities, especially when it's a local community voting to tax themselves to keep all those dollars in their community building facilities for their own children. So it's weird to me that Olympia thinks it has more answers for local school districts and more regulation than those communities believe is needed. But that's just a reality of politics, and there's a reason we have different views on that. It tries to protect the taxpayer, but when it's voted by the people locally to stay locally, we should get to simple majorities. That's an easy thing to say. It's harder to do politically. The studies right now that are going on are legislature directed, just really trying to understand how much the state matches. As you recall, there was a court case here in the last 2 years in our state where the court essentially said it's not the state's sole responsibility to build capital facilities. Unlike the operating budget, operating schools, there's a basic education justice to that, and the state has to pay for all basic ed to operate. They didn't say that in capital. They said it's a shared responsibility. Our court said it's partly local and it's partly state. They didn't decide that balance. So I think what lawmakers are trying to figure out is what is that balance? I would suggest to you right now it's certainly not enough. If we're 43% of the state operating budget, it's like, why are we less than 25% of the state capital budget? Asking families locally to tax themselves again with property to build a derelict school or an unhealthy or an unsafe school seems to me that responsibility should go up. Part of this, however, is so what should the state build? If the state's going to increase its contribution to the match here, the shared ratio, can the state expect everyone to build a very common elementary school? Or does each community get to hire its own architect and design its own thing? Those are more costly. It fits community need, which makes sense when right now the local community is footing most of the bill. But if the state did increase its share, can we get to some reasonable templates, some things that drive down the cost of design and even construction to lower the cost of taxpayers? I think those are really reasonable things, and that's what that group's looking at.
Lisa Superville with the Seattle Times.
Hi, good morning, Superintendent. Thank you for doing this and thanks for taking my call. I had a follow-up question on the portion that talks about potentially requiring districts to have a minimum fund balance. I was curious about whether you're recommending that they keep a certain percentage, or you recommended the percentage that they should keep. And you also talked about financial training for school board members and compensation. I'm curious whether that comes with a larger conversation about compensation for school board members generally for the time they spend doing the work, not just for the financial training that they'll have to go through, but the actual work that they do as school board director. Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. We'll take them in reverse order here. I do support significantly increasing the expectation of school board members to get training on managing budgets, and I do support higher compensation for board members. What's not known for most people in the state, again, this is why I love this and I'm grateful for you all being here, is we get to expose some truths. If you're on a city council or a county commission or a port commission, those aren't great salaries, but it comes with enough to at least cover childcare or, maybe go to a part-time in your job, your day job, in order to do that. School boards, have a funding formula that hasn't been raised for something like 40 years, their compensation. So it's mostly a volunteer activity. I think if you compensate more appropriately, it changes who's willing to do it. I think it makes the races more competitive. It's pretty alarming to me that 43% of our state budget goes out to 295 school districts, and a ton of those races aren't even challenged, and sometimes people don't even run for them. And so then the board has to appoint. There's a governance failure here in this, and so compensate them, create the incentive, build more talent and more energy around that, allow them to actually afford childcare to go to a meeting, or in many cases, several meetings a week as a school board member with subcommittees. So we support proposals that either do that, pretty significantly, or at least catch up to the inflation over the last 40 years on that minimum. So those are pretty important. And then as far as the fund balance goes, what you'll see in our proposal is, again, this minimum and maximum. There's some debate in the public sector whether it has to be 1 month's worth of operating costs, which is an 8% fund balance. Probably not. The public sector is so stable that you probably don't need that level. And then there are 2 tiers that we think about. If you are a very large school district where you can leverage other resources and you have large capital reserves for building replacements and stadium replacements, you don't probably need the same level of minimum, but you do need a minimum, versus a small school district. They may not have any of that. Their building replacement fund, or if a snowstorm wipes out the roof in an elementary school, it's their general fund balance that they're going to use to do that. And so we think there's a reasonable process here to have sort of 2 tiers: large, very well-resourced districts with one rate and small districts with another. But again, we're dialing that in. We just think it's important that the state make a clear expectation that fiduciary responsibility has lots of aspects to it. By the way, I didn't mention it, but the other thing I think matters is representation. And so I support legislation, and we're going to put it forward again this year, that makes the larger school districts have director districts. Most districts elect 5 people. Most of them separate that into divisions so that neighborhoods are represented, but we still have some large districts where everyone's at large. And so it's possible everyone's elected from the same neighborhood and there is no representation, the other part of town or something. So I really support that. We've seen lots of litigation in this state when failure to have districts and cities and other things is a discriminatory activity. So let's get these elections more local. That's another form of accountability. You'll see that legislation as well. I think it's already filed.
We have one more question from Denisa with the Seattle Times.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for responding. I appreciate it. Just going back to the earlier conversation about enrollment, I know you said that the vast majority of the decline that you've seen is tied to birth rate. I was curious whether you saw any other patterns or trends in the enrollment data as you looked at it statewide, whether by district size, geography, or anything like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. The question is, do we see any other patterns in the data around enrollment? We're always looking at that. One of the things that intrigued me after the pandemic was what we think we sort of observed in some ways, which is communities that had more wealth had more opportunity for a parent to stay home. They had more options in their community if they wanted to send their kid to a private option. And I think what we observed early on is sort of more affluent areas, and this was true in Massachusetts and Illinois and Florida and elsewhere, where it tended to be some suburbs that had more folks pull their kids out. Rural communities don't quite have those options, and they tend to really like their local school. It's more of the center of the hub of their community. We'll keep looking at those patterns to see if they hold up. Right now, it seems pretty darn consistent. Now that we're back to this sort of just incremental growth in homeschool and private school, it doesn't seem to have a big geographic trend, but we'll look at that for sure. We'll look at demographics to the extent we can. We have great data on who we serve. We have less great data when they leave, but we have ways of doing data matching to see if there's a disproportionality. And so we're always looking. Nothing really stands out right now, but we'll look by geography, urban, suburban, rural, and we'll look by race, ethnicity, just to see. What we do know, and you can sort of report consistently, is elementary kids are far more likely to be in a homeschool environment than middle and high. Families tend to do that early on. It's important to them. And then as math gets really hard, for example, or they feel like they don't get access to curricular materials, there's a big return along the way. I showed that to you in the demographics there. But then certainly by high school, a lot of those students say, I want to be a part of the athletics. I want debate classes, and I want chess clubs, and I want to be in student leadership, and I want the diverse course offerings that are here. And so our public schools have such an amazing ability to meet kids where they are for the most part, that I think that trend won't change. You're going to keep seeing the numbers jump from 8th grade to 9th grade in our public schools.
That's it for our questions.
We have one more question in here. Yeah.
So I want to go back. There's two initiatives that are likely to be on the ballot. We talked about one, but the other one deals with an initiative that was adopted by the legislature in 2024. They changed it in 2025, but they adopted it in part because the OSPI had said that it really wouldn't change a lot of what was going on in the districts. Where are you going to be on that initiative, and how hard are you going to work to pass it or defeat it based on the position of OSPI in 2024?
Yeah, so we've been really consistent here that for a long time, our school districts have balanced both health privacy as well as student data privacy, and those are really different things. So we haven't changed that. We think the system for decades and decades has made pretty clear what's available to parents, and we want them to get all of the access to their student's record, their official record. They should have all of that stuff. There is still medical privacy stuff, though, that is not of our doing. That is other state laws, or in some cases federal privacy laws, that are going to be in conflict here, and everyone's trying to find that subtle point. There is also student privacy rights in the state that are less clear. So let me give you an example. When a student struggles in a class and that grade is entered in the official record, that parent needs to be able to see that immediately. When a student sits down with a counselor and says, hey, my parents are struggling at home, or whatever the story might be, or maybe there's an abuse situation, or just anything, that's protected right now. The ideal world is that the parents or the guardians and students have the most communication. If a student is transitioning and they identify as transgender, and even if they aren't, going through a medical procedure, our expectation is that parents and kids have the best communication. And if that isn't happening, that's mostly on the family to figure out. And in some cases, it's not safe for kids to come out. So our laws protect that kind of thing in our schools. It's not that we don't want parents to be fully informed, it's that the law does give some rights to kids. And this initiative is trying to figure that out. And I think the first version of it that I saw certainly didn't respect student privacy. I think it's very different to honor a kid's pronouns, for example, in school. It's very different than calling a parent when a kid changes their pronoun, being proactive. And it's not that I don't want parents to know that, it's that I expect parents to know that already. That's not the school's responsibility necessarily to constantly tell parents this. As a classroom teacher, at times I had 140 kids, and I couldn't tell you the religion or the faith of every kid or their family. So when they said something against what I thought the parents might be, am I supposed to call them and say, hey, your student just said a terrible thing around this faith that I think you have? Or they came to school and I don't think you'd appreciate the way they dress. Or I heard them swear in the lunchroom. Like, at what point is the school just there to teach reading and math, which is one of the criticisms we get from a conservative crowd, is just focus on the basics? That's what schools are trying to do, as well as, put supports around kids. But then there's this narrative of every single time you hear something that doesn't seem right, you should call a parent immediately. And again, I don't have the right numbers, but I would argue that happens 90, 95, maybe 99% of the time, school violence and kids needing help. But there are some legal protections for kids that I'm going to continue to uphold. And I'll read the initiative again. The legislature tried to reconcile that, and I supported that. I'll see if it's out of bounds again under the new initiative. I suspect it is in some places. We've got some challenges right now with school districts who aren't following current law based on some of our early interpretation here. So it's a hard question to answer because I'm unequivocally going to support students. And I, ironically, despite what some of my critics say, I unequivocally support parents. But you are the kid's first teacher, and that relationship matters the most. And so I don't think we can safely pick and choose when schools are supposed to pick up that phone or not, except the obvious stuff, right? The very obvious stuff. So we're going to let it play out. I am very likely to oppose the initiative because I don't think it protects medical privacy appropriately. And I don't think it creates the safest environment. And again, I think until it became a national strategy, a national political strategy that's now in our state, I think our schools did a really remarkable job balancing that. And it's why 90% or 93% of our levies pass. It's why 90% of families put their kids in public school. There is a high level of trust at the local level with that teacher and that local community. It's when you start talking about these big national adult political themes that people, have a different opinion. And I respect it. It's just not really the reality in most classrooms. And I know I get criticism for that too. But that's what, 50, 60, 70,000 road miles over 9 years in this job to schools and communities and parents and families tells me, so. Yeah.
And you just touched a little bit, Chris, on what I was gonna ask about some of those school districts, Meade, Moses Lake, some of these other ones that have said that are passed resolutions, said we're going to comply with the federal directive, not what OSPI has said. I think there's 12 or 14 or some districts at this point that are in that situation. What's your message to those districts who say, no, we're gonna, comply with the federal directive, not what OSPI says?
Yeah, it's really clear. Follow state law, because there's no clear federal law on this, and a presidential's, memorandum or whatever he put out isn't law. So the safest legal path for them, because they have legal risk both directions. Some of those districts only see it one-sided, but they have legal risk both ways. Follow state law and then let the courts figure this out, or let our legislature if they're going to change it, or the voters if they're going to adopt this thing. But don't try to supersede state law because you have an ideological connection with the White House. I respect people's political decisions, but you're in a school board role or a superintendent role, your job by law is to follow state law. Our state laws are consistent with federal law. They already exist within Title IX. They already exist within non-discrimination laws. And in fact, our legislature has added student groups to protected classes of students. So this isn't also like it's a stale thing from 20 years ago and where are we today? Last year, they affirmed that that's where they are, and all of those lawmakers are elected by the people of Washington, and they've got a clear majority, and that's where they landed. So my message is follow the law. You are not wrong to express your personal opinions, but as fiduciaries to taxpayers and being on the executive branch, they have to follow the law. And most of them are, even though they sign that letter, it's more of a like, we wish it was this way. They're still following the law. Some of them perhaps not, and we have investigation processes to address the handful.
All of our questions for this morning.
Great, I'll wrap up here. Thanks everybody again for doing this. By way of reminder, we've got challenges in schools on the academic side, and we still got challenges on the attendance side, and certainly on the fiscal side. We've seen really, steady growth for the most part out of the pandemic on all of those things, but most of the time it's not pre-pandemic levels. Enrollments won't be pre-pandemic because of the declining birth rate, so there's no scenario where that happens very quickly. We take a comprehensive approach to measurement where test scores matter a lot. Again, we're, generally doing pretty well in literacy relative to the country, and the U.S. is doing really well relative to the world in literacy, not so much in math. We have math challenges. I've challenged the legislature to invest in math, spend more time talking about content. My counterparts across the country, who I have the privilege of being a leader in that association right now, their legislatures talk more about math and reading and science, I think, than ours does. That's not necessarily a criticism. We have a state that's very local control, so there's a reason for that. But it's okay to talk about that. Let's be honest about the data. We tend to be better than the national average. We tend to be quite strong in literacy. By 8th grade, of course, there's a lot of games that are played in 4th grade reading around the country. But by 8th grade, very strong. But let's talk about where we're weak. And we're weak in mathematics. It starts in elementary school where we don't spend enough time. It starts with families because everyone knows to read to their kid 20 minutes a day. But they don't necessarily know that from the earliest of ages, get those numbers in front of them and do flashcards and do word problems of math. Think about it as a literacy skill that is going to serve your child and your grandchild well for a lifetime. Our economy has changed so much that effective communication matters a ton. That isn't always classic literacy. And effective numeracy and data analytics and computer sciences and sort of the skills of quantitative reasoning, those matter more than we've ever seen them, but it isn't necessarily classic calculus that everyone needs. We just need more infusion of mathematics. It's an equity question. When we look at assessments, we still have big gaps. between students who are well-resourced and not, and that correlates, of course, with poverty. So again, great progress again this year, success in sort of moving the needle incrementally from one year to the next. We keep seeing gains, but we've got a big trajectory to do. And that means we've got to think about investing differently. We need more honest conversations around where the tax burden is falling on this state. It's okay to raise revenue, and we should more progressively. We will not survive successfully as a state if we keep stretching income inequality and tax inequality, but there's two parts of that. Shifting the tax responsibility more fairly to those who can afford to pay it, and reducing taxes to those who need help. That is not just a question of those who are in desperate financial systems. That's real. Middle-class families are struggling. From my perspective, I hear 10 times as much about the high burden of property taxes, especially the state property tax, because most of the others they get to vote on locally. I hear a lot more about that than other things, and that's what I'll bring to the table, because anytime I hear a community saying, I love my school, but I'm not sure I can vote for the levy because I can't afford taxes anymore, that is a tragedy. That tells me that's a very distressed family, and I hear that more and more. So appreciate you all being here. We have data for you all the time. Most of you who are on the call, remote or in person, know you can tap us for information. Our website's full of great stuff. We've got an amazing team here on the communication side that can get you what you need. We've got research teams, we've got data teams. So don't wait in between these things to do that. Get to us as quickly as you can. Again, thank you to TVW and all those who covered it. Let's have a session focused on the needs of kids, and to the best of our ability, notwithstanding very difficult topics from initiatives to tax reform, let's treat it like we have a shared mission in Washington State to lift up young people. Intergenerational justice matters a lot. Helping people think about their future with hope matters a lot. That's bipartisan. It's actually nonpartisan. But we tend to find ourselves believing that the quickest way to our clicks and our political victories is by making clear who we dislike or hate and who we like or align with. That's great for adult politics. That's a terrible way to invest in kids. So appreciate you all. I'm Chris Rakedale, State Superintendent. I'm gonna lean into this a lot over the next 3 years. I challenge you to do it, and I ask all of you to reach out to your lawmakers and say, focus on education and the well-being of young people, and please invest appropriately through fair taxation. Good to see you all. Thanks.